Hi, so I'm Tracy Epton. I'm a lecturer in the Manchester Centre for Health Psychology, as many of you know. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of exploring the effect of individual behaviour change techniques on behaviour. And I'm going to use goal setting as an example. So, don't know if you're aware, but there's 93 different behaviour change techniques in a recent taxonomy. Now, some you will have heard of, like goal setting, self-monitoring, and some you really won't be aware of, like reflecting on a valued self-identity. Now, to be able to design the best behaviour change interventions, what we really need to know is which behaviour change techniques work, who they work best for, and under what circumstances they work best. Now, this is actually quite difficult. So, the behaviour change techniques taxonomy is made up of all these different categories. And within each of these categories are a range of behaviour change techniques. So here are the ones for identity. And here are the ones for goals and planning. So you can see goal setting alone, there's two different techniques there. So it gets really messy when you're trying to work out which behaviour change techniques are effective, because behaviour change interventions are made up of many of these different behaviour change techniques. So this is an example of the behaviour change techniques involved in an intervention that I was involved in called You at Uni. Now this was quite a complex intervention. It involved 4 different health behaviours. It was based around 3 different theories. So it was quite complex, but had loads of different behaviour change techniques in it. So we don't know really which is the active ingredient. When an intervention works, we can't always pinpoint why it's worked. And if you think, well, that's just because it's a complex intervention. You know, it's a 4-module intervention across these different behaviours. But this is one of Chris's volitional help sheets. It's just a 2-minute intervention we give to people. And generally, we would describe this as problem solving, the behaviour change technique. But if you start to look at it, it's actually made up of several different behaviour change techniques in there. So even something very simple can involve a range of behaviour change techniques. So what we want to do is find out the unique effect of just single behaviour change techniques or groups of behaviour change techniques that we think go together. So what we need to do is find, from the existing literature, the randomised control trials that have used a particular behaviour change technique, and do this across a range of behaviours, so not just stick to health, do this across educational interventions, environmental interventions, and production interventions, as many different fields as we can find. And we only want to include those randomised control trials where the intervention and comparison group differ in the behaviour change technique of interest. So this could be studies that just have one behaviour change technique in the intervention group and then just have a measurement-only control. Or it could be where it's comparing 2 interventions, but just one of the interventions has that additional behaviour change technique of interest as extra. And then we extract the data from there, including the effect size, sample characteristics to find out who this works for, and intervention characteristics to find out when it works best. And then we can do meta-analysis and meta-regression to answer our research questions. So this, I think, is really useful because it helps us with some applied issues, because it helps us determine what the strength of the effect is. So anybody who's thinking of doing an intervention will be able to see, well, with this behaviour change technique, you can have a large effect or maybe a smaller effect. You know who it works best for. So you know that if you've got, say, a male population and you find that there's a certain technique that works best in males, you might want to use that. It's to determine circumstances under which it works best. So does it work best when it's presented online, or does it work best face-to-face? All these decisions that somebody who's running an intervention might have to make. It's also useful because it could contribute to theory. So if we can test aspects of theory in our literature review, we might find that actually it's supporting some parts of theory, it's suggesting other parts need to be amended. There's academic issues as well. So you can identify gaps in the literature, so you're not repeating work that's already been done. Or so you can tell people that actually this is the area, these are the areas that need to be focused on next. And things like making recommendations to adapt the behaviour change technique taxonomy. Are there some problems that you've come across, some issues where you're looking at these individual behaviour change techniques to suggest that this needs to be amended in some way? So I'm going to go through the goal setting review that I conducted along with Chris Armitage and Sinead, who's now at the University of Stirling. I put their photos up here so I wouldn't forget to acknowledge them. And then I'll discuss how it's influenced the factors that I've talked about previously. So, search a load of databases, Web of Knowledge, PsycInfo, PubMed, and ProQuest dissertations and databases, just to get at the unpublished literature as well. There's various search terms based around goal setting, so things like goal, targets, things like that to try and get the right literature. There was a filter which was looking for randomised control trials, so these are like randomised and trial or outcome and a list of other things. There was dependent variables, we're looking at things where they've mentioned goal, behaviour, performance, outcome, consumption, things like that. And I also did a further search of references of the included articles to get the ascendancy, which is standard. And I went through recent reviews and edited books of goal setting to locate more references. That's in green because that's a suggestion of reviewer 2, so I'm obviously still very bitter about it. So the inclusion criteria, it was all studies that compared an intervention condition with a comparison condition that just differed in goal setting. So as I say, it could be just a control group which was measurement only, or it could be an intervention and the two interventions just differed in the goal setting. We wanted the studies to be randomised, either cluster or individually randomised, and this is just so we're getting the gold standard for these kind of interventions to have a look at there. One to the dependent variable was either a behaviour or an outcome, because in the taxonomy there is goal setting for behaviour or goal setting for outcome. We thought we'd do the whole lot together and have a look to see if there was any differences between them. So a behaviour, to set a goal for behaviour would be things like, I'm going to eat 5 fruits and veg per day. If it's an outcome, this would be something like, I want to lose 1 pound per week. So they're slightly different. Some studies use both, some studies just use one of those. And written in the English language, because I'm monolinguistic, so we were just stuck with that. So this is the flow of papers through the study. So we ended up with 141 papers included in the main analysis and 38 papers included in a secondary analysis. And what we did with that analysis was we looked at behaviour change techniques that we thought that you could only do if you'd set a goal. So these were things like behavioural contract and making a commitment to a goal. So it was things that we thought, well, you would have to set a goal in order to do that second one there. So we included those as well, but not in the main analysis. It actually worked out at 384 effect sizes that we had in the main analysis, because different papers had multiple studies, or they'd broken things down into, say, males or females, or mastery goals and performance goals. So we tried to keep it broken down as much as possible so we could look at those different moderators. So what we found was that goal setting was effective. This is looking at both outcome and behaviour together. So there was over 16,000 participants in these 384 different tests. Cohen's D was 0.34, which is a small effect size. So using Cohen's metric, 0.2 is small, 0.5 is medium, and 0.8 is large. So you can see it's fairly small, but it was significant. And looking at it, it's comparable to the effects of other behaviour change techniques where people have looked at single behaviour change techniques. So there was a study I did about, a meta-analysis I did about value self-identity, so self-affirmation, and this was just in the health area, and that found an effect on behaviour of 0.32. And there was a recent meta-analysis on action planning, I think that was for physical activity, and that had an effect size of 0.31. So this is the kind of effect, it's like a small effect but comparable to other meta-analyses in the area. And we had a look, loads of different moderators, of who it works best for. And did meta-regression for this. So we found it actually was more effective when the sample had a higher percentage of males. And this was based on, you can see the K here is, tells you the number of effect sizes we looked at for that. So you can tell if it's just quite a small sample or a larger sample. That was across 268 effect sizes. And it was more effective with younger participants too. More effective with Asian participants, but this was based on a very small sample, 13 effect sizes. We found that it was actually, goal setting was more effective when the participants were recruited from the general population, so community samples, non-students, not children from schools. And we had 375 effect sizes in there, 45 of which were from the general population, so a sizable sample. Found that actually if children we sampled, that was more effective. And what really surprised us, given that everybody says, well, lots of psychology, lots of behaviour change is based on student samples, you're likely to get more of an effect because of a variety of reasons, like they're more educated or they're more motivated. We found that if you use university students, you actually got a lower effect than if you used non-university students. So when we were looking at this, we could find out some things we could recommend that maybe people should do when they were doing goal-setting interventions. So we found there was an effect. The more difficult the goal, the more effective it was on behaviour and outcomes. And the way we thought about this was easy goals. Well, what we did was we looked at every paper, and if they'd done some kind of pilot test, a pre-test, or a previous study, what we did was we looked at what kind of outcome there was on that, what the dependent variable was. So it would be like, say if people in that, the pre-test had eaten 3 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, we'd get the mean, we'd get the standard deviation, and what we'd say is, actually, if there's no, we'd basically say that an easy goal was not exceeding that. So if for this proper study they said, oh, well, we'll set that at 4, that would be an easy goal. A moderate goal was up to 1 standard deviation above what they said was typical, or what was in the pre-test or pilot. And a difficult goal was above 1 standard deviation of what we'd normally expect when people aren't setting goals in these pre-tests and pilots. So it was all based, it wasn't just a straightforward, we're going to class this as easy across the board, this is moderate across the board, this is difficult. It was based individually on each study and not just what the authors had said was easy, moderate or difficult, because that varied a lot between the studies. We found that because we'd looked at different interventions that just differed with adding on goal setting, we found that interventions that had a component of monitoring behaviour without feedback, so this is maybe where an experimenter was making notes while somebody was performing a certain task, but not giving the person who was doing the task any feedback on it, found that where that occurred, actually adding goal setting to it increased the effectiveness. We found that setting goals publicly actually increased performance of the task. And one of the surprises was group goals were actually better. So this is where you set a goal for a whole group. So maybe what I do with you lot is say, okay, we've got to eat 200 portions of fruit and veg today, rather than telling you you should all eat a certain number of portions today. So setting group goals was actually more effective. It was more effective if the goals were set in a school or were set in a workplace. So they had larger effects than interventions, goal-setting interventions that weren't set in those places. We also found some things that we recommend that you shouldn't do. So there were some studies that did this really annoying thing of measuring goal commitment. And they measure it before people actually started doing the task. And they do this only in the goal-setting group and not in the control group, so it's adding a different variable. And we found that actually measuring goal commitment was related to smaller effect sizes. So drawing attention to how committed somebody was to the goal did this. And then there's also where you manipulate commitment. So this is pairing the goal-setting intervention with commitment. So you know I said we actually included some studies there where they'd use goal-setting alongside another technique that we thought was related, that you couldn't do that without setting a goal. This was one part of that secondary analysis. So studies that had compared a comparison condition with a condition that had goal setting and making a commitment, such as getting somebody to say, I will eat 5 portions of fruit and veg a day, or even writing it down in that kind of way. We found that it actually had a negative effect. So the studies that actually had a commitment paired with the goal setting had an effect size of 0.2. And the studies that didn't have the commitment, if you remember before, had an effect size of 0.34. We did an analysis and found that these, although they're both small effects, they were significantly different. So something that we've assumed is a good thing was actually detrimental to people's behaviour. We found that you shouldn't set it in a university. This could well be related to the fact that also university students performed poorer at the tasks than non-university students. And we found that the ones which it was online or done via a computer, rather than having any kind of face-to-face interaction, they were less effective. But there was only 20 studies in that, quite a small amount of studies. Also found there was no difference if the goal was based on an outcome or if it was based on a behaviour. So we've got this distinction in the behaviour change technique taxonomy, but we didn't find any difference in that. The effect sizes were about the same. And we looked at how the goal was related to your current standing. So did somebody say things like, well, eat 2 more portions of fruit and vegetables a day? So if somebody who ate 5, they would have to eat 7. Somebody who ate 2, they would have to eat 4 portions. So that's based on your current standing. Or, did it make a difference if it was an external standard? So that would be just like saying, everybody eat 5 portions a day, regardless of where you are now. And we found no difference. It didn't matter which one of those you used. They both were equally as effective. It didn't matter if you set a number of different goals. So if I set a goal for eating 5 fruits and vegetables a day, but also set a goal for cutting down on chocolate and crisps, drinking the recommended amount of alcohol, that didn't matter. It didn't make any difference to the effect size. It didn't matter how many times the goal was repeated. So if I was doing an intervention where I set a goal today, and then I reminded myself of it in a week's time, or somebody reminded me of it in a week's time, and a further week's time, it didn't matter how many repetitions. It was just as effective as doing it once. And there was no effective task complexity. So this is a number of steps and decisions involved in completing a task. And luckily for me, there was a nice scale that somebody had already done about task complexity. So a low complexity task would be just some reaction time thing, or doing very simple maths problems. A highly complex task would be anything to do with science, engineering, university work and study at that level. Something moderate might be, I don't know, some kind of production task. And so that made no difference at all. It didn't matter if the task was simple or complex. Made no difference to the effect size. Other things that didn't make a difference were the means with which the goal was set. So it didn't matter if this was done verbally, like somebody telling you to do something, or you telling somebody what your goal was going to be, or somebody writing it down for you, or you writing it down on your own, or even some were presented via audio. Didn't matter the kind of mode that was done in. It didn't matter the proximity of the goal. So there was no difference between goals that, say, setting something for a month's time versus setting something for 6 months' time. Still equally as effective. And it didn't matter the interval between goal setting and the measurement. So it didn't matter if they were doing it within a week of the goal setting, doing the dependent variable measurement, or doing it within 6 months or a year of the measurement. So it didn't seem to have this big decrease of effect over time. We looked at some additional behaviour change techniques, so adding feedback to the goal setting, reviewing behaviour or outcome goals. So this is where you would set a goal, and then after a specified amount of time, you would go in and discuss it with somebody, and if you were performing well, you might increase your goal. If you weren't performing very well, you might decrease your goal to something more manageable, or you might keep it the same. There was no effect if you did that or not. There was no effect of adding a behavioural contract to the goal setting intervention. So this is where you actually write down and sign something. So a commitment is saying something out loud or writing something down. This tends to be writing something down, signing it. It's more of a formal process, and that didn't make a difference whether that was included or not. So these things we think goal setting might be paired with, where it should increase the effect, it actually made no difference. So we've covered the applied issues, which would be useful for people who want to do goal setting interventions, but found the theoretical issues really interesting. So the goal setting theory we based on is the old theory by Locke and Latham. And they said there's certain conditions that have got to be fulfilled to make the effective goals. So the goal has to be sufficiently difficult. And we did find evidence for this. So we looked at easy goals, and they had a small effect size of 0.25, which is still significant. and the same with moderate goals. So those goals do work, but if you look at difficult goals, that's at 0.45. So this is almost a medium effect size. So difficult goals, turned out when we did the analysis, they were actually significantly more effective than both moderate and easy goals. So this is what agrees with what Locke and Latham was saying. We did look at improbable goals as well, but what different papers said were improbable goals when we used our analysis on it turned out to just be difficult goals or even moderate goals. And so it was hard as well, with only 10, to look at if there was an effect of improbable goals. What we found also was that Locke and Latham say that people should be committed to the goal in order to perform best, and we didn't find evidence of this. So when you looked at the studies that included a commitment, so this is something like saying, I will eat 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, we found that that actually had a lower effect size of 0.2 than the studies where there was no commitment involved, where it was just goal setting without commitment. And that, if you remember, is at 0.34. And there was a significant difference between this when we did the analysis. Now, this could be due to commitment only becoming important when it's a difficult goal. But we didn't have enough studies to actually look at this. But remember, we also got the supporting evidence from when they measured a goal, goal commitment as well as manipulating a goal. And when they just did a measure, after people had set the goal, but before they did the task, they found that that actually decreased performance. So we don't think commitment to the goal actually works. Locke and Latham also say that task complexity should not be too high. So remember, task complexity is related to the number of decisions you make and the number of tasks that you have to do. And we found here that low complexity was 0.26, medium was at 0.22, and high was at 0.22. So there was no difference between those. We also looked at feedback. So when feedback is provided, this is meant to increase performance. But what we found was, in the studies where there was feedback, we got a non-significant effect, and it was at 0.01, so very small, no effect basically. But when there wasn't feedback included, if you remember, that's at 0.34, and these were significantly different. So it seems that feedback was actually damaging to the goal. But this was on a small number of studies, 25, so we do have to bear that in mind. So another thing I thought interesting was the academic issues. So we've looked at the applied issues, the theoretical issues, and now the academic issues, which can come out of these analyses. So we found there was no difference between goal setting when it was an outcome, so to lose £1 a week, and goal setting when it was a behaviour, so for example, eating 5 fruit and vegetables a day. So it didn't make a difference to the effect size. So we've got to question if it's worth distinguishing between these behaviour and outcomes. And there's loads of different pairs of these throughout the behaviour change technique taxonomy. So we can have a look further as we do more and more of these meta-analyses. So, as well, academic issues, we can look at gaps in the literature. And I expect you all to go away and just take one of these and work on it and come back to me in a few months' time. So, we're looking at, there was no long-term follow-ups. So there was only a handful of studies that did a long-term follow-up, and there was nothing over 12 months, which, given how popular goal setting is, that it's surprising that we have got such short follow-up times. It wasn't sufficiently tested in certain behavioural domains, so there's a large effect for environment, but there was only a handful of studies that were actually conducted in this field. Most studies were conducted among key populations, such as people with lower socioeconomic status, which given health inequalities is really important, and in key contexts like primary care. So there are big gaps in these areas. There were no studies that tested outcome goals and behavioural goals head to head. And given the taxonomy, I think this is an important thing to do, to see if there are actual differences there when we test them in one study. And we don't know really how to encourage people to set goals. So does training help? And we wanted to test this, but there were too few studies where they trained people to set their own goals. Will new technologies help? So having goals on all the apps we've got, all the websites, would that actually work to help people set goals? And you remember that we looked at some comparison conditions that had an intervention with the experimental condition that had the same intervention, just plus one behaviour change technique of goal setting. But there's 56 of the behaviour change techniques which weren't in those interventions. So we don't know if they work with goal setting. Goal setting improves them. And there was no exploration of mediators, so we couldn't look at that or report that. So this is to remind you to talk about these 56 different behaviour change techniques in a grant that we want to put in. So this is a grant that Chris, Armitage and I have put in. It's called the Learning to Fly. I'm just waiting for the reviews back now. So what we want to do is we want to develop a behaviour change intervention based around goal setting. And we want to do it from the ground up. So the first phase is a consensus approach where we get behaviour change experts together and we'll get them to identify candidate behaviour change techniques that we think would augment goal setting. Now you know this isn't simple because a couple of the ones that we thought would work with goal setting, turns out that they weren't that good. And then what we want to do, we want to take these different behaviour change techniques, pair them up with goal setting, and do a large online study with just testing out these different pairs against a control group and seeing which ones are most effective. And then we can go on to the third phase where we have, again, we form an intervention, a complex intervention based around goal setting where we take the most promising behaviour change techniques from phase 2. So these could be the ones with the largest effect size, it could be ones where people have managed to do them adequately, or that people like. And we can design and evaluate a complex intervention in a large randomised control trial. So it's just taking a different approach to it, building it up from the ground up, and seeing if we can get optimal goal setting interventions. Right, for future research as well, we're currently working on this at the moment with Corinne, Aphrodite, Chris and David from the centre, as well as other behaviour change experts from around the UK. And this is going to be a large meta-analysis, extra-large meta. And it's going to start off with a multidisciplinary consensus exercise to develop a template for conducting behaviour change technique reviews. And our starting point will be the template that we used for the goal setting meta-analysis. We'll get a group of experts to comment on that and to improve it. We'll get some reviews conducted by Corinne and Aphrodite on different behaviour change techniques to test out the new template. And then we'll have a final consensus exercise to finalise the template, and we can get it out there. And then we can get all the money to do all the different reviews, apart from the ones we've already done. And this is a good way of making sure that there is an overlapping of reviews that have been done. We're all doing it to the same standard, what is an agreed gold standard for that. So, thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions?